Welcome to the Grad School Femtoring Podcast, the place for first-gen students of color to prepare for grad school. This is Doctora Yvette Martinez-Fu, and I will be serving as your femtor, providing you with tips and tricks and everything else you need to know to get into and successfully navigate grad school. For over 10 years, I've been helping first-gen students of color get into top grad programs in their field, and I'm really excited to support you on your academic journey too. Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the Grad School Femtoring Podcast. This is your host, Doctora Yvette, and today I have a really fun and insightful episode on the topic of supporting non-traditional students and adult learners returning to college. Our guest today is Dr. LaTanya Rease Miles, affectionately known by many as LT. LT is the Director of Sales and University Partnerships at Rease Education. A first-generation college graduate and former Stopout student, LT has established two successful programs for first-generation college students, one at UCLA and the other at Loyola Marymount University, both recognized as first-gen forward institutions. She regularly consults with institutions nationally concerning first-gen students and also has advised local high schools about developing programs on their campus. Finally, she established and manages a national Facebook group that I'm part of too, called Empowering First Generation Students. Definitely join that if you haven't, y'all. And then she's also the chief strategist for the First Gen and Juice brand. So welcome to the podcast, Dr. LT.
Thank you, Dr. Evie.
So, we were just chatting before the recording, and I mentioned to LT how a lot of us know her from many different places, and I know her from my time as an undergrad at UCLA. And I feel like I would love to know more about your backstory, like maybe a little bit more, not just like who you are, what you do, but your background, backstory. How did you become the LT that you are today?
Oh my gosh. Origin story, as I'm surrounded by a superhero in this. First of all, thank you so much. Gosh, you and I have known each other decades now. It's crazy. So we don't have to date either one of us, but just to show the long history and longevity. And so I'm so happy and for you and proud of you as well. So I'm physically located in California in the San Francisco Bay Area, but I am an East Coast girl at heart. I'm from the Washington, D.C. area, Northern Virginia, right outside of Washington, D.C., and grew up there, living with my grandparents for a good part of the time. And with my mom, who's like my ride or die. I'm my mother's only child. She was a single parent, so not obviously, but pretty close. And it's so funny. I don't know if you felt like this or if this was true for you, but it was very evident for me that I was um, the first person in my family to go to a 4-year, but I didn't really think of myself as first gen. Like those aren't necessarily, your mindset can be pretty, different on that. Like, just based on the conversations in my house and knowing that no one went to college, I knew I was going to do that. But that identity of being first gen didn't come about till way later. But even before that, before the getting to college part, there's just little things that you realize in your family, and that also set me on a path. So I just give a lot of credit to my mom for her hustle and for her creativity, just things that help get me along the way, for her sacrifice. She was a teenager when she had me. And she just told me I could do anything, and she was just like my biggest fan and cheerleader. So that really helped. And for me, is one of the early lessons in realizing that even when our families or communities don't have a lot of college going knowledge, they do fill us with some things, right?
Yes.
So my mom just did the best that she could.
I love hearing a little bit more about your background, about your relationship with your mom, because I know that you recently recorded a video with her all about
Oh my
first gen
gosh.
legacy. And I know that today's episode is not about that, but I would love to hear a little bit more about
Yeah, but
that.
it does tie in though. It does tie
Yeah.
in because I know you want to hear about being non-traditional.
Yes.
And well, that's the thing. Like, I was the first to go and complete, but I wasn't the first to attempt. So there were a number of people in my family who, thanks to the military or what have you, took college classes and whatnot, and as adults and would be considered non-traditional in that way. And that includes my mom, and that also includes myself too. And we'll come back to me, I know.
Yeah.
But yeah, I've been meditating and marinating on this idea of legacy. I'm sure you have too, because you have your own family, you have your own
Yeah.
children to think about. And what does it mean to be first gen and your children are not, And then um, I started that series, but wanted to kick it off by talking to my mom to hear about her pathway as a non-traditional student. Um, Taking classes here and there for over 20 years before finally going to a
Wow.
4-year school and graduating. So that video you're talking about was just the intro. The next video will be more about her time in community college, and then eventually going on to a 4-year school and then a master's degree. Like, mom,
That's
she
incredible.
did it all in her 40s. Like, that it was crazy. So yeah, I hope you listen to the other videos. She was just so adorable.
I'm gonna link them in today's show notes so folks can
Oh,
also
please
watch
do.
the videos with you and your mom. When I saw it, I was like, wow, her mom looks so young.
Well, she looks young, but she also is young too. Like I
Yeah.
said, she was 16 when she was pregnant with me, and she had me when she was 17. Like, oof, I can't imagine.
Yeah, you've known her for a good portion of her life.
For
Yeah,
real.
it's
Yeah, I was
amazing.
I was like her little ride or die partner, right?
Yeah,
She never felt like a sister. That wasn't the authority was clear, but definitely like a partner for me.
yeah. And again, I know we're gonna get to the topic, but I'm curious how it is. As you reflect on your backstory, how it is that you got introduced to this work of working with first gen students, working with non-traditional students, or now adult learners. So there's a lot of like threads of working with
Oh my goodness.
students who we come from very different backgrounds, or we
Yeah.
need a little bit of extra support, or we are not the quote unquote traditional student by whatever is defined as traditional, whether it's age, gender, race, ethnicity, community that we come from. So how did you get to that? Because
Yeah.
we see the doctor title, so you went to grad school, you got a PhD. How did you get from that to now re-up?
Oh, that's a girl. We need more time for that.
Or just
But
like a quick thread of
quick.
like how you
Yeah, for
got
sure.
into
For
that
sure.
line
For
of
sure.
work.
Okay, and then just remind me if I'm not answering it fully. But let's start with something that you and I both share, both McNair scholars, right? So at the time, I was a student at Howard University. That was my second institution. I was a student at Howard University, and let's be real. I came from a family where if I had literally gone to college for one day, turned around and came back home, that was a major success because no one had done it, right?
Yeah.
So the idea of graduate school, like, what? That was crazy. So I thought I'll get a master's degree, right? I thought I'd get a master's degree in Afro-American studies. That was the plan. And I remember, Evie, that I saw this flyer for a McNair Scholars Program when I was a student at Howard, and I was like, oh my! I just saw the stipend, right? It was a
Hey,
five.
you're not the only one who noticed those things. Me too.
I was like, research, that's cool, but I
Yeah.
need this money, right? I need this money. I
Yeah.
just didn't know what research was. So, um, so I've applied for it, and that McNair program. So for everyone who doesn't know, McNair is a federally funded program. What was unique about the program there is that it was drawing students from different schools in the DC area. So much like the one at Claremont, right? You bring students
Yeah.
from all over. And so it was actually housed at American University, but I was a student at Howard. And so that was my first introduction to what is grad school beyond a master's, what is a PhD, what is research. I mean, and that changed my life. So that's the McNair program is what
Mm.
set me on the pathway toward getting a doctorate. And then like true story, like I said, I'm an East Coast girl through and through. Um, and I'm being encouraged to apply to grad school in this place called California at UCLA. And I'm like, what? My whole plan was to stay on the East Coast, no
Yeah.
lie. My plan was um my number one choice was UPenn, and then Rutgers, because it was just right up the road.
Yeah.
And I had an advisor who said, LT, you should, consider UCLA. And I was like, seriously, it felt like a foreign country. But all that to say, that's what got me on the pathway. Still not realizing I'm first gen, mind you, in a whole trio program, not knowing I was first gen. And it wasn't until I became a McNair director myself. Well, I was probably a coordinator at UCLA. I'm making my way through my graduate program in English and literature. My plan is to be a faculty member, but I'm also working for the McNair program. And there was a graduate student there who said, Tracy Buenavista, Dr. Tracy Buenavista,
Oh.
was like, LT, you're first gen, right? I'm like, what? Epiphany,
That's
epiphany.
wild.
Yeah. And so once I had that language, it was
Yes.
just it changed the course of my life. It changed the trajectory of my professional life, just wanting to bring the same level of awareness to other people that I had, because I suspect there was so many people like me who you kind of know, but not really, and you need some language
Yeah.
to help explain your experience. So that's what happened with me. Let me pause there. I know you want me to talk about getting to re-up, but let me see, that was the educational background, but any follow-ups to that?
And I think that's great. That's a great segue into talking about working with non-traditional students too. I know that McNair doesn't solely work with non-traditional students, but it does attract some of them. And a lot of the work that you do now is about supporting students who are returning, that are going back to school. So I wanted to have a conversation. Maybe you could get us started
Yeah.
with talking about, like, for folks who aren't as familiar with the terms, just like we, at some point we didn't know what first gen meant. Like, what do we mean when we say non-traditional versus, say, adult learners? And then even like in your bios, stop out students, I hear
Yeah.
terms like re-entry students. So there's a lot of different terms.
Yeah,
But there's some overlap between some of these. So like non-trad, for
absolutely.
instance, what do we mean when we say we work with non-traditional students or support non-traditional students?
Yes, ma'am. And let me start with, like, not these terms are contested terms, right? These aren't ones that everyone necessarily agrees with. There's some debates right now. If you go on LinkedIn about why are we using non-traditional, but at the same time, terms are actually helpful too. Even if you're pushing back against it, having a definition is really critical. But I would say that the term non-traditional is really a response to the way that schools, for the most part, are structured right now. Whether people are saying it out loud or not, a lot of the policies, programs, and resources assume that a student is 18 to 24 years old, and for the most part, a dependent on, financially dependent on parents, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so when we look at a way, let's say move in or orientation. Oh my gosh, orientation is a good example.
Yeah.
It's very much assuming that this is a student that's going to be escorted by their family and dropped off, right? So what it doesn't mean, what it doesn't reflect is the reality is that most folks in post-secondary education are actually over those ages, and maybe in school part-time, may be a caregiver, whether it's for their own parents or families or their parents themselves. So that part of the equation is completely, and is not completely, but it's very much invisible. So for me, when I'm hearing the term non-traditional, it is acknowledging those those groups of people right there. Um, I realize now that at some one point I was considered non-traditional. Again, didn't have language for these things of being first gen. For me, I was also system impacted for most of my childhood. My father was in jail, in prison, for being food insecure. All these things that I personally had an experience with, and so it was really interesting. I mentioned being at Howard University as a first gen student. My mom was super like supportive, but mom didn't know what she didn't know,
Yeah.
and she hadn't saved money for me, so I owed a housing bill at Howard University, and it had lapsed. You know how you have a bill, then you go into the next school year, so it was just sitting there. And at one point, it was the spring of my junior year, I came to my res hall and had I kid you not, a notice to vacate on my
Oh,
dorm.
wow.
They said you have 24 or 48 hours to move, pay this bill or move, right? And I didn't have the money, didn't know who to turn to or anything. So I essentially had to stop out of school for a period of time to figure out how was I going to pay this bill. My current, it was frustrating because my current balance was up to date. I just had that old lingering balance. And then the school kept telling me, well, you can't apply current financial aid to an old balance. It was ridiculous.
Wow.
So that this population that I'm intentionally serving at re-up is like, that is my own story. There was a
Mm.
period of time where I felt like I'm not going to finish college. I didn't know how to pay that bill. I was a junior. It was the end of my junior year, so I had all these credits, and Howard, of course, wouldn't release my transcript because I owed money. So I was like, how am I going to transfer? I would have to start over as a
Wow.
sophomore. um, and yeah, so I ended up getting married. I worked full time and I got married because I was like, this isn't going to happen, you know. Meanwhile, my husband, well, he was my boyfriend at the time, in a similar situation. He couldn't, well, he had academic troubles and financial troubles. He ended up, um, oh my gosh, Yvette, he ended up joining the military reserves to pay for school. You know, it's like I'm sitting on the couch and I see these commercials. Let me join the reserves. Girl, he got sent to Kuwait.
Oh my
He got sent to
gosh.
Kuwait.
I'm sorry.
And that
Oh,
disrupted my husband's schooling actually for 10 years. So anyway, all that to say, he was out of school, I was out of school, and we decided to get married. Thankfully, I was able to return. I went to a different school, but I was able to go back. And then he went back after we moved to the state of California. And then my mom went back to school later. So that's actually the history in my family, that sort of stop but not complete is way more
mm.
common than actually starting and completing. So that's the I get to impact who I was back then, you know, on a systemic level in the role that I have now at REIA.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, your story is actually not uncommon. I was reading on the ReUp website and I saw that this quote that it said that adult learners over the age of 25 make 38% of the total undergraduate student population in the US. And this was from something that was posted in 2021. So it was data
Oh,
from prior to that. So
that
those
is
numbers I'm
old
sure are
data.
way, way up now.
Hmm.
Um, so if that's such a big part of the student population, it doesn't make sense to me that that population is rendered so invisible in college campuses. And I'm wondering, because I know that you have partnered with institutions and to try to support this population. So what can institutions do? Like, there's so much that can be done from, top down, bottom up. So when it's like from the students themselves who want to go back, to like peers, to programs, to faculty, staff, and even up there admin. What kind of supports do these students need or benefit from?
I love it. First of all, let's talk about who these folks are likely to be. First gen, people of color, often.
Right.
Well, it could come, many folks of a variety of income backgrounds for sure. But again, we're not talking about like the typical thing you might see on a TV show, for example, right? This isn't about Greek life and partying and whatnot. These are people who are like often looking at school truly as social mobility as opposed to personal fulfillment only, right? Like my children have the great privilege and benefit of like only just worried about their own passions and whatnot. And that's not why all people go to college. But when we acknowledge the fact that, let's say, school might not be a top priority, number one, that people have other responsibilities, that changes the way that we should be messaging to them and reaching out to them and supporting them. And what I've really appreciated about the approach that Re-Up is taking is that we say from the outset when we're working with a campus partner, hey, for the population of students that we're reaching out to, we're not talking about a quick turnaround. This isn't like, hey, I'm going to message you on Instagram and have you come right back. We need to check in with you. Hey, Vet, how's it going? How are things going with your family? How are things going with your job? Have you talked to someone about your desire to come back to college? So this is going to be a long play. And so if a school is only interested in like quick turnarounds and gains, you're going to totally miss this population and they're going to be frustrated. Again, the other thing I'll say is we need to be thoughtful of how we're being student ready and not just making sure the students are campus ready. And I think that's really been the approach with this population is we'll sit here, we'll wait for them to contact us to say that they're ready, as opposed to taking the initiative with the student. Last thing I'll say about that, I think the gap that Re-Up is feeling is that, to be honest, a lot of schools don't have the bandwidth to do that. They don't have the resources, bandwidth, staffing, resources it takes to really, truly reach out to this population. And that's the gap that Re-Up fills. We have student success coaches and data and technology that can reach out to those students with an appropriate message. So it takes the heavy lift off of the institution.
And when you say that institutions, a lot of them are not equipped for this, is this primarily does this primarily fall on the admissions, different offices on campuses, or are there
Good
like,
question. It often, I mean, at some point it's going to touch enrollment management regardless, but sometimes it could be in academic advising or student success. Those are like the common ones, but you got to have some kind of conversation with enrollment management at some point though. But again, enrollment management often is focused on the next incoming class, right? Getting in those
or like getting them in, but not necessarily retaining them.
Yeah. And I mean, I was a transfer. Were you a transfer? I can't remember.
I was not. No.
Okay. And I transferred twice, and I know how it is as a transfer. Like transfers often are lower on the priority list, and then below that sometimes often are these adult learners or stop out students that they just go, they often are transfers, but they just are lower down the list. It's harder.
Yeah, I can imagine there's also a lot of myths potentially about adult learners, non-trad students. And so I'm wondering, like, what are some of those myths that you've heard about? What are some things that you wish that other people knew about this population?
I love it.
Yeah.
Number one myth is that they don't want to go back. And that's not true.
Thank you for saying that. Thank you so much. Because I do think that's a very, very common myth. It's like, oh, if they wanted to come back, they would just contact us.
They would just
not that easy.
It's not. That's why we have to meet them where they are, right? So, so here's what can happen sometimes, right? And again, I'll use myself as an example about not wanting to come back. So I desperately wanted to go back to Howard University. However, I mean, look at how I was treated as
Mm-hmm.
well. So there was some friction there for me, right? I really, really wanted to complete. I was working really hard, and I'm not saying this has to be the case, um, but I actually had really strong academics. I had a 3.8 GPA. I was an honor student, and you know, Howard was just like, "Sorry, we can't help you," right? Like, where was someone to like reach back out to me and
Yeah.
say, "How are you doing?" Honestly, that would have made such a difference if someone had just said, "Hey, Latanya, we see that you're not out. What can we do to support you?" So that's one of the big sort of misconceptions that we have about the population is that they're not interested um, or like you said, if they were, they would say something. Um, and then we also know it's a very heterogeneous population as well. So you'll see folks from all kinds of racial backgrounds. A lot of people of color, but certainly not exclusively people of
Yeah.
color as well. Um, so campuses have to like show a level of empathy and creativity, change some of these policies for returning, for example. Like, do you have to, you've already been a student there, do you have to go through that whole process? Like, how can we remove the friction for those students, or even that policy that they had about my transcript, like holding up my transcripts and whatnot. It's ridiculous. Here I was, an honor student, 3.8. I could have been an alum of Howard. Like, I mean, I am an alum, but I could have been a graduate of Howard
Yeah.
University. And now University of Maryland gets all the credit, you know? So there you go.
I was gonna say they're lost.
They're lost. They're lost. Yeah.
um, I get the sense that I have listeners who are themselves non-traditional students, who are themselves adult learners, who, you mentioned, some of them may be student parents, some of them may be
Mm-hmm.
caring for other types of dependents.
That's right.
And so I'm wondering if they themselves are those types of students, or if someone is listening who maybe put a pause and has that desire to go back to college, or even sometimes it's graduate school too. That's the other thing too, that yeah, we're
Right.
having a conversation about college, but there are a lot of folks who go to graduate school and they put a pause on that, or they leave when they're all but dissertation, when they're ABD. And so what kind of advice would you give to the individuals themselves who are at this like particular crossroads where they have felt in some way, shape, or form pushed out by the institution, but they have this desire to
Yeah.
finish?
Yeah.
What do they do? What kind of, what it's so hard because, like you said, not a lot of institutions have the level of support to really help to ensure every single person is retained and successfully finishes. So
Mm-hmm.
it sometimes is on the students to themselves seek out help. And it's hard. It's
Hard.
really, really
Yep.
hard. Yeah.
Here's what I love though about working with this population, is that sometimes we don't have time for games anymore, right? I think I think about who I was when I started at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill as a freshman versus who I was by the time I got to University of Maryland, which was my third institution. And mind you, I was married at that time, right? I didn't, or close to being married. Like some of those things that seemed important, joining a sorority or being liked or what, I just, they weren't as important to me, right? So I was much more focused, and I had learned to really speak up, right, and really advocate for myself. So you have to remember that you have it in you to do that, even though like the folks that are around you may appear to be younger or whatnot. You often know what you need, and you have to be your best advocate. having said all that, that can be tiring at the same time. So I think it's really helpful to connect with people who are in similar situations. For better or worse, I think UCLA has done a really good job of bringing communities of students together. Um,
Hmm.
like at the transfer center, I'm just using UCLA as an example. Other schools do it too. But having a transfer center, having programs for students with dependents,
Yes.
finding those types of communities are really important. But here's the thing, that this is why so many so-called non-traditional and adult learners are at online for-profit places, because they make those policies so easy, right? It's so easy to apply. It's so much harder to get
Right.
into UCLA than it is to go to University of Phoenix or Strayer
Yeah.
or what have you, because they've reduced that friction.
Yep.
Now, having said that, you can get into those schools, but how many folks are completing? Now that's a whole other thing, because those schools aren't providing the actual human support that you
Yeah.
also need to actually get through. So there's the getting in, and then there's the getting through, and then there's also the going on to graduate school part. Um, I will say I'm very proud of the fact that we were at the McNair program at UCLA, very intentional about identifying students with those so-called non-traditional backgrounds. Maybe they had worked for a while or they had families. Thinking of like Darlene Edgley, for example, a number of folks, so that they feel welcome, not like some kind of uh, like some kind of freak there.
And those are the programs that really make a difference. That's why so many folks are, to this day, some of my closest friends are folks that were in similar programs, and that's how we met.
That's how
It's
you meet. Yeah.
having that support, having the mentors, the femtors, having spaces where you're not the only one. That makes a big difference. Like you mentioned, some of the examples, whether it's students with dependents, or the transfer student center, or I worked at UC Santa Barbara, and they have the Ondas program, which is primarily for first gen students, and
Yeah.
both first year and first gen transfer students. And that makes a big difference, to show up in a space where you see yourself represented in some way, shape, or form. That
It
that's
matters.
Yeah, and that's kind of one thing too, is if folks decide to go on to graduate school, to look out for those resources too, as they're
Yeah,
making that
definitely ask.
decision.
Ask for those resources. And I look, family, I know it can be really tiring, but sometimes it's just not on the radar of the institution. And people can make a difference. At the same time, though, if people are feeling so much pushback, then that might not be the best fit for them as well. So it's one thing to like say to an institution, hey, this is what I need. How responsive are they? That's really the next question. Yeah,
Yeah. And no institution is the same. You said you started
that's
at
right.
Howard and then you went to Maryland. So, just because you may have had a not so great experience somewhere, doesn't mean you can't, have a better experience and finish somewhere else. So that's something I'm
Yeah.
also taking away. Yeah.
Well, you had asked this question too. We have to acknowledge that sometimes the institutions have caused harm, right? And
Yeah.
how do we redress the harm? And
Yes.
again, that's where the human touch comes in. That's where the listening comes in. Um, that I may say to you, I'm not interested right now, but check back with me in a couple of months, and doing that. So being accountable and actually following up, that shows good faith, you know. I'll say it again. If Howard had reached back out to me or helped me out, I would be a Howard graduate. One of the reasons I chose to become a dean is because I first of all said to myself, if I was ever in a position to help a student the way a dean ended up helping me get into University of Maryland, that I was going to do it. And then once I became a dean, realized, oh my goodness, schools really can make some of this drama go away. I didn't say this. You know what? I owed $1,100. That's all I owed, girl.
Oh my goodness.
$1,100. As student LT was like, oh my God. because all I could afford was $50 a month, right?
Yeah.
50, 50, 50. That's a lot of months only paying $50 a month, right? A dean LT looks at that and like, oh my gosh, you make that balance go away. If it
Yes.
meant retaining the student, you apply a grant or whatever, you give the student work, whatever, you make that
Yeah.
happen, and so as a student, we don't often see that. We just see the bill that's in front of us and like, okay, well, I guess I just got to go to work. So yeah, I feel like I've been very blessed and fortunate both on a institutional level to make a difference and now like on a
Mhm.
national, much bigger scale to really, um, like I said, give what I didn't have.
You just shared some hidden curriculum stuff
Did
right
I?
there because as a first gen student, a lot of folks don't necessarily know that there are people that will advocate on your behalf, that some things you could potentially negotiate. Like just like as I've gone on my own financial education journey, finding out, oh, you can negotiate your healthcare bills. What? This is a thing.
This is a thing.
Yeah, finding out that you owed $1,100 and there might be someone out there who owes a certain amount and thinks that I could never afford this, and also that it's not going to go away, whereas you could talk to other people who could advocate on your behalf and maybe figure something out.
You just don't
It
know.
does, and that's the thing, like it a lot of us don't know to ask and don't know who to ask and don't know that there are folks out there willing to help. And so I'm just glad you mentioned that because a lot of it has to do with knowing it, to ask for help, and then knowing who to ask, and then not giving up. Because there are going to be a lot of barriers. There are, a lot more barriers when you're saying the institution is not built to necessarily support these types of
Mhm,
populations.
mhm.
So you have to put yourself out there a little bit more, and a lot of us don't know that we can do that.
That we can do. Can I leave it to me to tie this back to pop culture, right? I think this is why there's that moment in the last Spider-Man movie that really resonated with those of us who are first gen. And it's this moment where Peter goes to Doctor Strange and Peter nor his friends got into MIT, right? And so he goes to Doctor Strange and he's like, hey, I need you to like go back in time. Can you reverse time to a place where I wasn't the villain? So then, therefore, I can get into MIT. And then Dr. Strange says to him, did you just call to couldn't you just call MIT and have them, rethink your admission? And Peter's like, I can do that. A lot. When that movie came out, so many people like tweeted me or texted me like, LT, did you see this? Like, I felt that. And it's just what you're saying. Like at that moment, Peter Parker seeing the hidden curriculum, like, oh, I was told I didn't get into MIT. Case closed. And to know that there's this other pathway, this other door, like, oh no, fool, you could just
Those are the side doors. I keep telling people,
just
I'm like, remember, there are front doors, what you see that's in front of you, that's on the website, that's, on, but then there are side doors that are only
yes,
available if you
yes,
network, if you build community, if you know folks, if you have
yes.
your like little group of folks who advocate on your behalf. And again, like a lot of us get left out because we don't know.
Hmm.
So thank you for reminding us and bringing it back to pop
Hey,
culture
it's
too.
right there. Peter Parker, first gen working class hero for sure.
Oh. So
Absolutely.
we're gonna get close to wrapping up, but I wanted to see if there's any other closing words or advice that you have for folks who hear about these experiences and see themselves being reflected, and whether they themselves have gone back or are thinking of going back. What kind of advice or closing words do you have for them, for folks, thinking of returning to school, whether it's college, grad school, you name it?
Yeah, I'll just reiterate and stress something I said earlier, that number one, you have it in you to achieve it. So for many of us, again, don't want to make assumptions necessarily, but many of us have overcome a lot of obstacles, and I suspect a lot of those obstacles were way harder than going to class, to be to be honest. So keep pushing forward, and then number two, find your community, and if you don't find it, build your community.
Yes.
And I've had to do both, right? For sure. I'm never representing myself only when I'm in a space. I'm representing all the other people that helped me get there. But absolutely, there were times where I show up and I don't see myself represented. I don't see my people represented, and I have to build the space. So um, uh, for as rigid as sometimes these institutions can be, there is a level of fluidity sometimes too. And I'm always a glass half full person. I'm always an optimist, and I think there's often an opportunity for us to create and to build as well. And sometimes it's not even at your home institution. For me, I do a lot of building in digital spaces, digital communities as well. So don't be afraid to do that for sure.
Speaking of digital spaces, for
Uh-oh.
folks who really enjoyed this conversation and want to follow you, support your work, want to be in touch, how can folks reach you?
It's crazy. As you know, I'm everywhere all over the
Enough.
place. Oh, it feels that way. It feels that way. It's crazy. Um, for folks who are still on Facebook, um, we do have the Empowering First Generation Facebook group. 7,200 people. It's crazy all over the world at this point. It's a good place, especially if you have some questions or you're just wanting to identify best practices or find community. There's that Facebook group. And there's an Instagram called First Gen and Juice, which is really focused on the representations of the first gen experience in mass media and popular culture. I am right now speaking to a Catalyst Award nominee from last year,
Thank you.
Grad School Femtoring, nominated for Best Podcast last year. Congratulations on that nomination. But yeah, we want to highlight and let people be more aware of the representations of first genness in so many spaces, whether it's podcasts, TV shows, movies like Spider-Man, or books. And so yeah, people can follow First Gen and Juice, and then I'm just on LinkedIn as well.
So we'll add all of that. It'll be in the show notes. Your LinkedIn page, First Gen and Juice Instagram, the Facebook First Gen Facebook group, and then of course earlier today we talked about First Gen Legacy. We'll make sure to add the video
Oh my
as
gosh, yeah, that's gonna
well.
be so dope, man. Come
I'm
talk
really
about what it's
excited. You've
like to be
got
a
so
parent.
much going on.
I'm
Uh,
blessed.
I love it. Well, thank you so much, LT, for being a femtee or a femtor. Sorry, I'm the femtee, a femtor to so many of us, and for coming on the show today. I loved
Pleasure.
hearing more about your backstory that I actually didn't know. And I think a lot of us are going to benefit from this conversation on supporting non-trad, supporting all the different types of populations, adult learners, reentry, stop out students, you name it. Like we all deserve that kind of support. So thank you so much.
Thank you, lady. It was a pleasure.
Thanks so much for joining me in the Grad School Femtoring Podcast. If you liked what you heard, here are 3 ways you can support the show. The first is to make sure you're subscribed and leave a review of the podcast. If you leave me a review on Apple Podcasts, you become eligible for a free half-hour coaching session with me. Yes, that's right, 1 free session. Once you leave a review, you can email me a screenshot and I'll send you a link to sign up. The second way to show your love is to get yourself a copy of my free 15-page Grad School Femtoring Kit, which includes resources on research, organization, grad school, and career prep. Go to gradschoolfemtoring.com/kit to get it today. The third and last way to support my show is to follow me on social media. I am on Instagram, LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, and occasionally TikTok with the handle @Grad School Femtoring. Thanks again, and until next time.